What would you do if your HOA tried to evict you from land your family owned for 3 generations? They tried to kick me off my own family cabin, locked my dock behind a steel gate, and waved fake surveys claiming my land as theirs. But they didn't know the truth. I held the documents my father hid for decades, the kind that can flip an entire HOA upside down with one move. The morning it happened, the lake was buried under a curtain of pale Wyoming fog, the kind that hangs low and clings to your clothes like a cold hand. The porch boards creaked under my boots as I swung the cabin door open, expecting nothing more dramatic than the scent of wet pine and the quiet slap of water against the dock. Instead, the first thing I saw was a sheet of bright red paper plastered crookedly across my front door, its edges damp, its message loud enough to punch the breath right out of me. Evicition notice. 30 days to vacate. The word evicition was even spelled wrong, an insult layered on top of an outrage. But that wasn't the part that made my jaw clench. At the bottom, in blocky black letters, was the signature. Aspen Ridge, HOA, President, Bethany Cole. I stood there a long moment, the fog curling around my shoulders, feeling the kind of slow, rising disbelief that eventually turns into heat behind the ribs. My family had lived on this land since my grandfather first built the cabin with his own 2 hands. 3 generations of Hales had slept under this roof, patched these beams, and hauled water down at this lake. And now some HOA I never voted for was telling me I was trespassing on community lakefront property. A sharp crunch of gravel made me lift my eyes. There she was, Bethany Cole, standing across the narrow path like she'd been waiting for her cue. Red jacket zipped up to her throat, hair pulled tight into a bun so severe it could have cracked walnuts. She had her hands on her hips, chin lifted just enough to make it clear she believed she was the sheriff of these parts. Her lips curled in a thin line of satisfaction when she saw me reading the notice. "Morning, Mr. Hale," she called, like she was greeting a neighbor instead of a man she was trying to evict. "You'll see that the board has made its decision. The cabin sits on restricted community shoreline. You're in violation of multiple articles." I held the paper up between 2 fingers. "You're evicting me from my own home." Her smile tightened. "From property managed by Aspen Ridge, yes. You'll have 30 days to remove your belongings. If you need clarification, it's all in the packet." She gestured toward a thick envelope tucked neatly under a rock on my porch railing, as if she expected me to thank her for the convenience. The fog behind her seemed to glow with the early sun, giving her silhouette a strange kind of authority, the kind that only matters to people who don't know a damn thing about the land they're standing on. I stepped down from the porch, boots crunching on damp gravel. "Bethany, my family owned this cabin before Aspen Ridge existed, before any of these lakefront showpieces were built, before your bylaws, your landscaping plans, or your committee meetings." I held the notice up again, letting it flutter in the cold air. "How exactly do you evict someone from land that's theirs?" Bethany didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Instead, she took one step forward, lowering her voice as though revealing a secret. "Not everything is as simple as old memories and old stories, Mr. Hale. Property evolves, laws evolve, communities evolve, and some structures," she cast a pointed glance at my cabin's weathered logs, "don't fit anymore." For a moment, all I could do was stare at her, not because of what she said, but because of the certainty with which she said it, as if she truly believed that time gave her ownership of what belonged to me, as if paint colors and HOA fees could overwrite 3 generations of sweat and history. My pulse thudded in my ears. The fog felt thicker. Something inside me, not anger yet, but the ghost of it, rose to the surface. Behind Bethany, her SUV idled quietly, exhaust drifting like a second layer of fog. I caught a glimpse of Jake Cole, her husband, the developer, sitting behind the wheel, pretending to scroll on his phone. but the slight tilt of his head told me he was listening to every word. Of course he was. He was the one who'd been sniffing around the lake for his new luxury hillside project. I'd overheard enough conversations at the general store to know anyone standing between him and lakefront exclusivity mysteriously became a problem. Bethany cleared her throat. "I trust you'll cooperate," she said softly, as if the matter was settled and my life could be packed neatly into boxes. I folded the notice carefully, too carefully for the anger burning at the edges of my vision. "Bethany," I said, "what makes you think you can treat the owner like the squatter?" Her expression shifted for the first time. Not fear, not guilt, annoyance. "Because," she replied, "the board has documentation, surveys, records you clearly don't have, and if you did," her smile sharpened, "I'm sure you would have used them by now." Then she turned on her heel, walked to her SUV, and slammed the door. The tires crunched over the gravel as the vehicle rolled away, disappearing into the fog like a ghost escaping daylight. I stood there alone, the red notice pinched between my fingers, a cold wind sliding down off the lake. The fog lifted enough for me to see the faint outline of my dock, my father's dock, stretching into still water. Trespassing. On my own land. Fury, slow, controlled, settled into my chest like a stone dropped in deep water. I looked down at the notice one more time. 30 days. 30 days for them to realize they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. I folded the paper and slipped it into my jacket, feeling the cold crinkle against my ribs as I stepped off the porch. The fog had begun to lift, revealing the calm stretch of Hale Lake, still as glass, tinted silver under the morning sky. For a moment, the world felt exactly the way my father always described it. Quiet, stubborn, and patient. Nature didn't rush, and neither did the truth. It simply waited for the right moment to surface. My boots crunched over the gravel as I walked toward the dock, letting the cold sink deep into my lungs. The boards of the dock groaned under my weight just the way they used to when my father and I fished at dawn. I crouched down and trailed my hand along the weathered wood, tracing the grooves and knots like they were old scars on familiar skin. My father had repaired this dock a dozen times, storms, ice, and age all taking their toll, but he always said the same thing. If you care for something long enough, it remembers. The HOA didn't know the history here. They didn't know about the summers when this lake was the only thing that kept my family above water, figuratively and literally, when drought choked the valley and ranchers downstream relied on our old earthen dam to ration out what little flow we had left. They didn't know my father spent half his life walking these boundaries, checking the water outflow, patching leaks, filing paperwork with the county office. He treated the dam like a living thing, and this lake like an old friend. They certainly didn't know who they were dealing with now. I stood and walked back toward the cabin, heat rising steadily under my collar. My father's old metal filing cabinet sat in the corner of the main room, same place it had been for decades. The handle stuck, as it always did, but with a little yank, the top drawer slid open, releasing a dry smell of dust, ink, and old cedar shavings. The folders inside were labeled in his neat, stubborn handwriting. Boundary lines, dam maintenance, water rights transfers, county communications. It hit me harder than I expected. Grief has a way of sneaking up, quiet at first, then sharp as a snapped branch. My father had died only 6 months earlier, and I'd spent most of that time drifting through chores, fixing what needed fixing, avoiding what hurt too much to face. This cabinet was one of those things. But now the HOA had forced my hand. If they wanted to rewrite the history of this land, they were about to learn the truth was written in ink far older than their bylaws. I flipped through the drawers, sorting through survey maps, receipts for concrete. sketches of the dam's original design, handwritten notes about drought measurements. Then, near the back, I found a folder that didn't belong with the rest. The tab read simply, Lakebed, 1984. I frowned, pulled it out, and opened it carefully. Inside were a series of stamped documents, certified copies from the county recorder's office. They showed something I had vaguely heard about years ago but never took seriously. During one of the worst drought seasons in the valley, when water levels dropped low enough to expose parts of the lakebed, my father had filed ownership claims on the exposed sections. Not just shoreline, actual lakebed. The claims were notarized, signed, sealed, and legally binding. I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening around the brittle pages. The HOA didn't know about this. Bethany certainly didn't know. And Jake Cole, developer extraordinaire, man with a blueprint for every hillside he could get his hands on, definitely didn't know. No wonder Remy's warning from the other day suddenly echoed so loudly in my mind. I grabbed my jacket and stepped onto my porch, just as Remy Johnson walked up the path from his side of the lake, his hands shoved deep in his canvas coat pockets. His gray beard was flecked with frost, and his breath curled in little clouds as he approached. "You see that circus act this morning?" he asked, jerking his chin toward the road where Bethany's SUV had vanished. "Oh, I saw it," I said, holding up the red notice. "Seems the HOA thinks I'm a trespasser now." Remy snorted. That woman wouldn't know real land ownership if it hit her between the eyes. Jake's been talking up that hillside development for months. He's been bragging at the diner that he's cleaning up the lakefront for future investors. I guess your cabin doesn't fit the magazine pictures he's selling. He picked the wrong family to push, I said quietly. Remy studied me for a moment. Your dad had more paperwork on this place than the county courthouse. If they think they can shove you out, they're in for a rude awakening. That's what worries me, Bahasa. Why act so confident? Why push now? Remy shoved his thumb toward the hillside. Because Jake wants exclusivity. Rich folks like to brag they've got lake access nobody else does, and as long as you're sitting on your dock, they don't. I let my eyes drift across the lake again. The fog was finally lifting, revealing the pines standing tall along the shore. Sunlight glinted off the water, throwing little sparks of silver across the surface. It didn't look like a battleground. It looked peaceful, untouchable. But peace only lasts when no one tries to take it from you. Remy patted my shoulder. You need anything, you call me. I've lived next to this lake my whole life. And your daddy? He was the only reason the HOA didn't try something sooner. I nodded, swallowing the knot forming in my throat. My father had faced down developers, land surveyors, and newcomers with deep pockets for decades. He'd kept the lake intact because he understood something the HOA didn't. Land wasn't just dirt. It was memory. When Remy left, I went back inside the cabin and placed the Lakebed 1984 folder on the kitchen table. The papers glowed faintly under the morning light. They felt heavier than their weight. Heavier with meaning, responsibility, and something else I hadn't expected yet. Advantage. The HOA had made their move, confident and smug. Now it was my turn. I rested my hands on the table, leaning over the documents. "Why'd you hide these, Dad?" I whispered. "And what were you trying to protect?" The fog had fully lifted now, revealing the lake in all its cold beauty. But beneath that still water were secrets the HOA didn't know existed. And I was about to find out just how deep they ran. By the next morning, the red eviction notice was barely dry before the HOA began circling like buzzards. I first heard them before I saw them. 2 engines idling at the end of my gravel drive, tires crackling over the frozen dirt. When I stepped outside, coffee still steaming in my hand, a pair of bright yellow safety vests stood in stark contrast to the dark pines behind them. 2 HOA compliance officers, clipboards in hand, faces blank like they were clocking in for a shift at the factory. "Mr. Hale?" one of them called. I didn't answer right away, letting the wind speak first as it rattled the chimes my father had hung on the porch beam decades ago. He cleared his throat. "You've been issued multiple violations this morning." I stared at them. "It's barely 8. "Yes, sir," he continued, completely unfazed. "We start early." He handed me a packet, another stack of printed forms edged with HOA letterheads. I didn't need to open it to know the format. Violation after violation, fine after fine. A machine built to squeeze until someone cracked or sold their home just to make the harassment stop. "What's the violation this time?" I asked flatly. The man looked down at his clipboard, then back up. "Your pickup truck is classified as a recreational vehicle and cannot be parked in visible areas." I let out a disbelieving laugh. "It's a '98 Chevy. She barely recreates." The other one spoke up. "Your firewood pile exceeds acceptable aesthetic standards. It must be relocated or reduced." "My firewood?" I said slowly, making sure I'd heard correctly. "Stacked exactly where it's been for 30 years? "Yes, sir. It's visible from the North Trail path. That path is on my land." Both men shifted slightly, avoiding eye contact, refusing to acknowledge the truth they likely already knew. They were just tools, sent to chip at me piece by piece. "Anything else?" I muttered. The first man nodded. "A landscaping enhancement crew will arrive later this afternoon to install uniform shrubs and shoreline improvements for the community aesthetic." I blinked. "On my property?" He hesitated. "On community shore frontage." There it was, the narrative they were pushing. The same lie Bethany had stood on my porch and tried to dress as fact. I folded the packet slowly and tucked it under my arm. "Get off my land," I said quietly. They both stiffened, plastering on robotic politeness. "Sir, we're just doing our—" "Get off my land." Something in my tone must have reached them, because they wasted no more words. They backed away, climbed into their white HOA-branded SUV, and rolled down the drive with their windows up tight. For a moment, silence returned. The lake shimmered under the pale sun, ripples catching the light like scattered coins. But the calm didn't last. Around noon, the rumble of a flatbed truck shook the earth under my boots. A landscaping crew hopped out, uniform shirts, shovels, rakes, trays of decorative shrubs that didn't belong anywhere near a natural lakeshore. I walked down to meet them at the property line. "You boys are on the wrong land," I called. One of them, a young guy with nervous eyes, handed me a folded work order. "We're contracted by Aspen Ridge HOA. Says here to plant shoreline screening along this stretch." He pointed directly at my dock. I held up the paper. "And you're planning to do this without the owner's permission?" "Well, they said—" "I don't care what they said. This is private property. If you cross that line—" I tapped my boot on the boundary my father and I had marked years ago. "You're trespassing." They exchanged looks. They didn't want trouble. They didn't want to be in the middle of this. After a moment, the young guy sighed and signaled to the others. Tools went back on the truck, engines fired up. They backed away down the dirt road without another word. But the HOA didn't like losing small battles. They came back swinging that night. I was locking up the barn when I saw it, a new steel gate glinting in the moonlight. It hadn't been there that morning. Fresh concrete footings anchored its posts into the earth, and a thick padlock sealed it shut. The gate stretched across the narrow path leading to my dock, blocking the only direct access point I'd used since childhood. On the other side of the bars, my dock floated peacefully on the water. My father's wooden rowboat rocked gently at its mooring. The quiet contrast made the gate feel even more insulting. I approached it slowly, running my hand over the cold metal. Welds still smelled faintly like burned steel. This hadn't been an overnight job. They'd been planning it, preparing it, waiting for the right moment to slam it into place like a trap. A motion light triggered across the water. I glanced up the hill and saw a figure in a red jacket standing outside one of the luxury lakefront homes, arms crossed, posture stiff, head tilted just slightly down toward me. Bethany. Watching. Waiting. Measuring my reaction. I lifted my chin, meeting the glare she cast across the lake. A silent conversation passed between us. One she thought she was winning. One she believed she had already won. I placed my hand on the lock. It was heavy, new, and smug in its own way. I didn't force it or try to break it. I merely let my fingers rest there, making a promise the metal couldn't hear, but she could certainly feel. You don't know what I have. You don't know what you're standing on. And you have no idea how big a mistake you've just made. I turned away from the gate, the cool air biting at my face as I walked back toward the cabin. The wind rustled through the dry needles of the pines. Somewhere in the dark, a distant owl called out, a lonely, hollow sound that echoed across the lake. They were pushing me, hard, but I wasn't about to break, not on this land, not on my father's lake. The next morning, frost clung to the pine needles like tiny shards of glass. The sun was barely up, throwing long blue shadows across the ranch road as I made my way down to the new steel gate the HOA had planted overnight. It stood there like a challenge, metal cold enough to bite skin, padlock shining with the smugness of fresh money. A gate on my land, a lock on my path, an uninvited hand squeezing around my family's history. I stood there a while, letting the early light warm my face. The lake behind the bars glimmered, calm and indifferent, as if unaware of the fight building on its shores. But the quiet didn't stay quiet for long. I heard her before I saw her. The click of expensive boots on gravel, the sound slicing through the morning like a blade. Bethany Cole emerged from the trailhead, red jacket blazing in the cold like a warning flare. Her expression carried the same stiff superiority it always did. Chin high, lips pressed thin, eyes full of condescension, dressed up as confidence. She stopped a few feet away from me, hands locked on her hips. "Mr. Hale," she said, her breath turning into white puffs in the cold air. "You're trespassing on Aspen Ridge community property." I didn't move. "This is my dock. My father built it." She gave a tight, humorless smile. "According to updated surveys filed with the county, this portion of shoreline belongs to the community. Your father's outdated paperwork is no longer relevant." I turned to face her fully. "Outdated? That's what you're calling legal deeds now?" Her smile thinned. "The board is confident in our documentation. You should familiarize yourself with the changes, Marcus. Property lines are fluid when it comes to community development." Her choice of words struck me like a hammer. Fluid. As if land and water suddenly shifted to match the HOA's preferences. As if they could redraw boundaries with nothing more than confidence and signatures. I reached inside my jacket and pulled out my father's old map. Folded so many times, the creases felt like soft cloth against my fingers. I unfolded it slowly, letting the past breathe. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but every line was etched with the precision only years of measuring and remeasuring could give. "This map," I said, holding it between us, "shows the original shoreline, the one recognized by the county for decades." Bethany didn't even look at it. She waved a manicured hand as if sweeping away dust. "Old maps don't reflect new community projects. This dock is positioned on HOA property now, and your access is restricted." Then she pulled out her own document, a modern printed survey with crisp blue lines and a bold Aspen Ridge watermark stamped across every page. She held it out like a sheriff presenting a badge. "You see?" she said, tapping the page. "This is the updated layout. The dock is clearly within HOA-managed frontage. I took the survey from her, hand, and studied it. It didn't take long to see what they had done. Shifted lines just enough to give themselves control of the prime shoreline. Not real surveying, not real measurements, just digital lines adjusted to serve an agenda. "This isn't accurate," I said. "You moved a boundary." She stiffened. "We clarified it." "No," I said, my voice low and steady. "You changed it." The air tightened between us, the cold morning suddenly feeling brittle. Her jaw flexed, and for a moment I saw a crack in her confidence, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "Whether you accept it or not," she said sharply, "the board has the authority to enforce community regulations. You are obstructing HOA property and violating Article Bethany." A new voice cut through the tension. Sheriff Dalton stepped out from the trees, his boots crunching on the frosted dirt. His beige jacket was zipped high, and his hat cast a shadow over eyes that had seen more disputes than he cared to count. He walked toward us with the kind of steady calm only lawmen and old cowhands ever mastered. "Morning," he said, nodding first to me, then to Bethany. Heard shouting all the way up the ridge. Bethany immediately straightened, smoothing her jacket. "Sheriff, good timing. Mr. Hale is interfering with HOA operations and refusing to comply with community boundaries." Dalton's eyes flicked to the gate, then to me. "That true, Marcus?" I held up the old map. "She's claiming this dock and shoreline belong to the HOA, but my father's paperwork says otherwise, and so does the land itself." Dalton took the map carefully, scanning the hand-drawn lines with an expression I recognized. A man weighing truth against noise. He wasn't quick to speak. He wasn't quick to believe anyone either. Bethany stepped forward. "Sheriff, the HOA's survey supersedes." Dalton raised a hand. "Bethany, let me look." For a long moment, only the wind spoke. Pine branches swayed above us, creaking softly like old bones. A loon called from across the lake, its cry echoing into the cold morning. Finally, Dalton folded the map and handed it back to me. "Marcus," he said quietly, "you need to dig deeper. Your father fought off developers long before any of this was built. If he kept records this detailed," he patted the map, "there's more where that came from." Bethany bristled. "Sheriff, with all due respect," he cut her off. "Until the county verifies boundaries, no one touches this gate. No removals, no installations, no enforcement." He paused, fixing her with a level gaze. "Understood?" Her jaw worked, clearly unused to being denied. But with the sheriff standing there, she forced out a clipped, "Fine." Dalton tipped his hat and walked back toward the trail, leaving a silence so tight it felt like wire. I could feel Bethany's anger radiating off her like heat from a stovetop, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of meeting her eyes. I folded my father's map and tucked it safely inside my jacket. The dock behind the gate rocked gently on the water, innocent and patient. Bethany finally exhaled sharply. "You can stall," she said, her voice low, "but you won't win. This land belongs to the community now, not to the memories of one family." Then she turned and strode back up the path, her boots cracking the frosted dirt like a metronome counting down a clock only she could hear. But my clock had already started ticking too, and unlike her, I had the truth on my side. Buried deep, old as the lake, and waiting to surface. The morning sun finally crept over the ridge, melting the frost into tiny beads that slid down the pine needles. I walked back toward the cabin with the slow certainty of a man who'd decided something heavy. The gate, the fake survey, the smug confidence in Bethany's voice, they weren't random acts. They were steps, calculated ones. And if she believed she had the upper hand, that meant she thought I didn't know where to look. But she didn't know my father. He never trusted outsiders with anything tied to this lake. Its water levels, the dam's condition, the flow control charts, or the old family agreements filed when the land was still wild. If he hid something, he hid it where no one but a Hale would ever think to search. I grabbed my coat, a flashlight, and the ring of old keys my father used to carry on a loop at his hip. They jingled softly as I headed down the narrow trail that led to the dam. The path wound through tall pines, their trunks rising like pillars in a cathedral of cold morning air. I could hear the low, steady hum of water flowing through the old spillway, a sound I'd grown up sleeping to. Comforting, familiar. A heartbeat under the land. The pump shed sat where it always had, half tucked into the slope beside the dam, made of rough timber and corrugated steel, leaning slightly like an old man tired of standing straight. My father built it when I was a boy, patching it every few years instead of replacing it. He claimed new structures couldn't be trusted. Old ones already proved themselves. I slid the key into the lock. It stuck, like it always had, until a firm twist finally forced it open. The door groaned, hinges complaining after months of silence. Inside, the air smelled like engine oil, mud, and time. Dust motes drifted lazily in the strip of sunlight that cut through a crack in the boards. The familiar clutter greeted me. Rusted tools, coils of rope, the old emergency radio my father swore he'd fix one day. But my eyes went to the back wall. A panel of metal, dull, bolted, out of place, had always bothered me. When I was 12, I asked my father why it didn't match the rest of the shed. He'd ruffled my hair and said, "Some walls do more than hold up roofs, son." I didn't understand him then. I did now. I crossed the dirt floor, knelt, and ran my fingers along the bolts. They were solid, but the metal plate had a slight give, a false wall, a hiding place. My breath fogged as I pulled a flathead screwdriver from the nearby bench and began loosening the bolts one by one. The last one clattered to the ground, and the panel shifted forward with a slow metallic sigh. Behind it sat a waterproof metal box, sealed, heavy, coated in dust thick enough to testify to years of waiting. My heart thudded as I lifted it out. The latch resisted before finally popping open with a soft click. Inside was the truth. Certified county maps with embossed seals, old water rights transfers dated back decades, a handwritten ledger of drought-year lakebed acquisitions, letters from the county surveyor referencing boundary updates my father contested and won. And beneath all that, a folded lease contract for the land the HOA now used for their main parking lot and community center, a lease that had expired 2 years ago. I sat back on my heels, breath steadying as the weight of it all settled on me. My father had known this fight was coming. Maybe not with the HOA specifically, but with someone. Someone who wanted what this lake could offer. Someone who believed money and influence could rewrite the earth. He'd prepared for war long before I realized there would be one. The morning light warmed the box in my lap, glinting off the official seals. My father's voice seemed to echo in the quiet shed. "Know every inch of your land, Marcus. If you don't, someone else will claim it." I thumbed through the documents slowly, absorbing every detail. The lakebed purchase from the drought year, legal, certified, and uncontested, gave ownership of the lake bottom itself. And the lease? It clearly stated temporary permission for the HOA to build their community center across the upper lot, but it was never renewed. They weren't tenants anymore. They were trespassers. The truth wasn't just on my side. It was ironclad. I slipped the documents back into the box, closed it tight, and carried it outside. The dam's low rumble echoed around me as I stood at the edge of the spillway, the water sparkling under the rising sun. It felt different now, still familiar, but heavier with meaning. A resource, a weapon, a shield. On the walk back to the cabin, I rehearsed what I'd say to the HOA when the time came, but the words didn't matter. The papers would speak louder. When I reached my porch steps, Remy Johnson appeared at the property line, waving his hat. "Been looking for you," he called. "HOA folks been sniffing around again. Something big's up. You okay?" I lifted the metal box and gave him a tired smile. "Better than okay." His brows shot up. "What's that?" "A headache for Bethany," I said. "And answers I should have found sooner." He let out a low whistle. "Your old man always said that lake held more secrets than fish." "He was right," I replied. The wind stirred, carrying the lake's cold scent and the distant creak of the steel gate they'd planted on my shoreline. It didn't feel like a blockade anymore. It felt like a dare. I looked out across the water, pulse steady, breath calm. They wanted a fight over land. I was finally ready to give them one, but the HOA wasn't done testing how much pressure a man could take before he cracked. They didn't know my father, and they sure didn't know me. The next few days crawled by under a sky so bright it almost mocked the tension simmering around the lake. The wind carried more than cold. It carried unease, the kind that settles in your ribs and refuses to leave. Every morning, new tire tracks scarred the gravel near my drive. Every night, shadows moved where there shouldn't have been any. On the fourth evening, I heard an engine rumbling out front long after dark. When I stepped onto my porch, a white security truck idled at the end of my driveway. The headlights cut through the night like two angry eyes. The driver didn't get out. He didn't call out. He just sat there, engine humming, watching. I folded my arms across my chest and stared right back. After a long minute, the truck eased away, its tires crunching slow and deliberate as it disappeared down the road. The taillights were barely gone before another pair of headlights swept briefly across my property, another patrol making another slow lap. Bethany had upgraded her war tactics. She was using intimidation now. The next morning, the proof of their growing desperation came scratched into the side of my pickup. The word "leave" stretched across the driver's door, long and jagged, carved deep enough to hit the primer beneath the paint. I ran my fingers over the grooves, cold metal biting back. This wasn't a message. This was a threat. I took a step back, letting out a steady breath as the early light glinted off the damage. Whoever did this wasn't just following orders. They were angry, and anger makes people sloppy. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Then I noticed it. A small black shape perched high on the nearest lamppost, its lens pointed straight at my truck. A security camera. New, and aimed directly at my property. I clicked my tongue in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me." That afternoon, I called Remy, who showed up in record time, boots muddy, hat crooked. He studied the scratch, then the camera, then let out a low whistle through his teeth. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore," he muttered. "HOA's got Harold patrolling nearly every hour. Man's been itching for a fight since last winter. Wouldn't surprise me if he's the one who carved this." "Proof would be nice," I said. "Funny you mention that." He tapped his phone. "I set up a trail cam near the fence a couple nights ago. Figured they'd try something." We stepped inside the cabin, where he pulled up the footage. It showed a blurry figure crouching near my pickup just after midnight, moving fast, glancing around nervously. The man had a heavy build, same jacket Harold always wore, same way of leaning forward like he was forever stuck in half a stride. Not perfect evidence, but close enough to raise eyebrows. "Send it," I said. He nodded. "Already? Did." But the HOA wasn't done. 2 days later, I woke to the sound of metal clanging down by the water. I followed the noise, boots crunching on frost, until I reached the shoreline. A construction crew was gathered around the dock, measuring sections of it, spraying bright orange marks across the wood, preparing to cut. What's going on here? I called. The foreman turned, holding a clipboard. Dock demolition and reconstruction. HOA request. We've got a permit signed by President Cole. The man handed me the paperwork. The county's stamp glared back at me, but something felt wrong. The signature was Bethany's, but the legal parcel number listed on the form wasn't theirs. It was mine. My lot. My lake frontage. A hollow thump echoed behind my ribs. You can't start work here, I said calmly. This permit is fraudulent. The foreman frowned. Sir, we don't deal with property disputes. We just follow the paperwork. You follow the law, I corrected, and this document violates it. Before he could argue, gravel crunched behind us. Sheriff Dalton stepped out of his cruiser, hat low, shoulders tight. Someone must have called him. Morning, folks, he said, voice level. What's the situation? The foreman handed him the permit. Dalton read it slowly, eyes narrowing. He looked up at me. This your lot line, Marcus? It is, I said. HOA never had authority to issue this. Dalton turned back to the foreman. Until the county verifies this permit, all work stops. No exceptions. The foreman lifted his hands. Fine by me. The crew packed up. The spray marks still stained the dock, ugly reminders of what they almost destroyed. Dalton drew me aside. Marcus, you need to be careful. I've gotten 3 calls from the HOA in the last week, all complaints about you. Now I'm seeing questionable permits. This is turning into a mess. It's already a mess, I said, but I'm not backing down. He held my gaze. Then document everything, and don't confront anyone alone. He drove off slowly, leaving a trail of dust hanging in the cold air. That night, around 2 a.m, my dog Ranger growled low from beside the bed. His ears perked, body rigid. I slid out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and peered through the window. 2 figures stood at the property line, one shorter, one taller, illuminated by their own flashlights as they examined the survey stakes scattered across the ground from last year's minor repairs. They weren't supposed to be there. No one was. I lifted the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam caught the reflective stripe of a jacket. The taller figure snapped their head up. Bethany Cole. And beside her, Harold. They froze like deer caught in headlights, whispering urgently before hurrying back toward the trail, light bobbing wildly as they fled into the trees. They weren't doing routine checks. They weren't patrolling. They were searching for something, or checking to see if something was still hidden. The next morning, I found fresh footprints leading straight to the marker I'd placed near the old pump shed trail. They'd been close, too close. The war had escalated from intimidation to criminal acts, and the HOA's veneer of authority was beginning to crack. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I had the documents. I had the proof. And soon, the whole county would know exactly what the HOA had been up to. They wanted to corner me. Instead, they exposed themselves. The morning after catching Bethany and Harold skulking around my property, the lake sat under a gray sky, the surface smooth as polished stone. A storm was building, not in the weather, but in the air, in the way birds stayed quiet, and the wind came in restless pulses. The land felt like it was waiting for something to break. I called an old friend of mine, Cal Donnelly, a professional surveyor I'd worked with back in my dam safety days. If there was anyone I trusted to reestablish boundary lines properly, it was him. Cal showed up just after sunrise, worn canvas jacket zipped up to his chin, survey equipment rattling in the back of his truck. He stepped out and took one look around. Heard your HOA's gone rabid. That's one word for it, I said. Ready to stir the pot? He grinned. Born ready. We hiked down the shoreline with Cal's GPS gear clipped to his vest. The lake was low enough this time of year that the old markers my father had hammered into tree roots decades ago still peeked through the soil. Cal set up his tripod, adjusted the laser, and worked with a quiet efficiency I'd always admired. Every time the device beeped, confirming a coordinate, he planted a bright orange survey flag into the ground. And each flag told the same story. The HOA lines were a lie. Bit by bit, the true boundary of my land revealed itself. The flags drew a bold, undeniable line that curved around the lake, across the grassy slope, and up toward the community's prized structures. Cal checked his screen, then glanced at me over the top of his glasses. "Marcus, you might want to brace yourself." "What now?" He walked several yards ahead and planted another flag, then another, and another. The path the flags traced made my stomach tighten in a mix of vindication and disbelief. "They built on your land," Cal said. "A big chunk of it. The community center, parking lot, even half their dock, all of it sitting on the wrong side of this line." I let out a slow breath. Then it's time they learned the definition of trespassing. Word spread faster than wildfire in dry brush. Homeowners trickled out of their lakefront houses, gathering in little clusters, staring at the flags like they were explosives waiting to detonate. Murmurs rose, questions, disbelief, frustration, all of it swirling like dust around a stampede. By the time Bethany arrived, I was standing near the ridge where the orange flags cut straight across the front steps of the Aspen Ridge Community Center. Her red jacket flashed like a warning against the dull backdrop of storm-colored clouds. She marched toward me, face already flushed with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "Correcting your mistakes," I replied. She jabbed a finger at the nearest flag. "These are lies. Fabrications made by someone you paid off." Cal snorted softly beside me. "Ma'am, my readings are certified. And these corners match the whole county's original deed maps." "I don't care about old maps," she snapped. "This is community property." I reached into my coat and handed her the expired lease contract, the one my father had kept buried in the dam shed. "This says otherwise. You had permission to use this land for 10 years. That was 14 years ago. You've been squatting ever since." Her eyes widened at the document. For a moment, she actually faltered, caught off guard, the mask slipping. Then she rallied. "We will contest this. The board will file an emergency injunction." "You had your chance to renew the lease, I said. "You ignored it. Now you get 14 days to vacate. Same warning you gave me." Her jaw dropped. "This is absurd." "No," I said, stepping closer, lowering my voice. "You thought you could bully me off my own land. You didn't think anyone would fight back. And you sure didn't think someone like me kept records better than your entire board combined." Residents around us whispered, some shocked, some visibly relieved, a few even hopeful. For years, Bethany had run the HOA like her own personal kingdom, enforcing rules that changed with her mood. Now that kingdom was crumbling. I handed her a formal notice, signed by me, drafted with Sarah Lynn's guidance the night before. "To the Aspen Ridge HOA," she read aloud, voice shaking. "You are hereby notified that your structures, namely the community center, parking lot, and dock, are located on privately owned land. You have 14 days to remove any unauthorized improvements or negotiate new terms." She looked up at me, fury burning in her eyes. "You can't do this." "You did," I said. "I'm just giving you the same courtesy you gave me." The crowd stirred again. Even Harold, hovering near the back, shifted uneasily, his earlier bravado evaporating as the reality of the situation sank in. Their empire wasn't just cracking. It was sinking straight into the lake bed my father had claimed decades earlier. Bethany tried to rally. "The board will meet today. We'll handle this internally." "Good," I said, "because come tomorrow morning, these flags are going to be the talk of the county office." Her lips parted, but no words came out. She spun on her heel and stormed away, nearly tripping over one of the survey flags planted right at the corner of the community center foundation. Behind her, homeowners stared at me with a mixture of shock and curiosity, some unnerved, others suddenly emboldened now that they'd seen the Queen's armor dented. Remy walked over, rubbing his chin. Well, that's one way to start a civil war. Not a war, I said. A correction. Feels like both, he murmured. Maybe he was right. As the wind picked up, rustling the orange flags like flames licking at dry timber, I felt the shift deep in my bones. A turning point. The moment the balance of power began to tilt. The HOA had been certain they controlled everything. Now they couldn't even trust the ground under their feet. And I wasn't done yet. The days leading to the county hearing moved with the strange heaviness of a coming storm. Quiet, tense, thick with anticipation. Word had spread beyond Aspen Ridge, trickling across the valley and into town like a whispered warning. At the diner, at the feed store, even at the post office, folks asked the same thing. Is it true the HOA built their whole center on your land? I never bragged, never raised my voice, but the truth didn't need volume. It carried itself. Sarah Lynn drove up from town that morning in her dusty blue Subaru, parking near my porch with a folder tucked under her arm. She stepped out and shivered against the crisp Wyoming breeze, her dark hair whipping around her face. You ready for this? She asked. Ready as I'll ever be. She handed the folder to me. Every document, every map, every transfer, every lease. We've got more truth than they've got excuses. I nodded, feeling the weight of the box inside the shed echo in my chest. Then we headed out. The county building sat in the center of Willow Bend, a small square brick structure with a flagpole out front and wind-blown evergreens standing guard on either side. As we approached, I spotted a cluster of Aspen Ridge residents gathered near the entrance. Some looked furious, others looked scared, and a few, for the first time, looked hopeful. Inside, the main hearing room buzzed with low murmured conversation, the kind that swells and recedes like lake water, lapping against old pilings. Rows of metal chairs lined the floor, already packed. At the front, a long table held the commissioner, 2 clerks, and a microphone that squealed every time someone adjusted their notes. Bethany and Jake sat on the left side of the room, flanked by 2 HOA board members and a lawyer who looked too polished for a town this small. Bethany's red jacket was back, pressed, zipped, defiant. Jake leaned toward her, whispering something through clenched teeth. Her jaw tightened. Sarah and I took our seats on the right. Remy sat behind me, hat in hand, eyes sharp. Sheriff Dalton leaned against the wall near the back, arms crossed, observing everything. The commissioner cleared his throat. We are here today to review disputes regarding property boundaries, alleged misuse of lakefront structures, and adherence to county permitting laws. The room quieted. The air thickened, and the hearing began. Bethany's lawyer stood first, buttoning his suit jacket like a curtain rising on a performance. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice smooth, the Aspen Ridge HOA has maintained the community lakefront property responsibly, lawfully, and continuously for years. Mr. Hale is relying on outdated documents, papers that no longer reflect the evolved modern boundaries of the area. A murmur rippled through the crowd. He continued, waving a glossy packet in the air. This is the most current survey, approved by the board and filed digitally. The community center, dock, and parking lot have been maintained by Aspen Ridge since their construction. Any claim that they sit on Mr. Hale's land is misinterpretation or confusion on his part. Bethany nodded vigorously beside him. Then it was Sarah's turn. She rose calmly, setting a stack of neatly organized documents on the podium. With all due respect, she began, modern doesn't mean correct, and digital doesn't mean legal. A few quiet chuckles drifted from the gallery. She held up the original county maps, thick paper, official seals glinting under the fluorescent lights. These are certified, archived, and identical to the ones filed by the county decades ago. The documented boundary line is clear, and the HOA structures extend well into Mr. Hale's legal property. She passed the maps to the commissioner, who studied them intently. Then she displayed the old water rights transfers. The room leaned forward. Residents whispered. Even the clerks exchanged glances. "These aren't hobby documents or forgotten relics," she said. "They were filed, stamped, approved, and honored by every previous landowner and county official." The commissioner raised a brow, tapping the seal with his pen. Sarah wasn't done. She clicked the next page onto the projector. The expired HOA lease, complete with signatures, dates, and a clear termination clause. 14 years ago, she said, the HOA leased land from Mr. Hale's father to build their community center and parking lot. That lease expired 2 years ago. They were notified. They failed to renew. They are currently occupying private land without permission. The room erupted into shocked murmurs. A few residents gasped. Someone near the back muttered, "I knew it." Bethany's lawyer tried to object, but the commissioner silenced him with a raised hand. Then Sheriff Dalton stepped forward with the trail cam evidence Remy had captured. Grainy but unmistakable footage of Harold trespassing onto my property at night with bolt cutters. Dalton also provided a written report detailing the attempted unauthorized demolition of my dock with a questionable permit. The commissioner leaned back, exhaling slowly. "This is substantial." Finally, Sarah called Remy to testify. He described fines that seemed to appear whenever someone disagreed with the HOA. He described the intimidation tactics, the sudden rule changes, the way Bethany treated the lake as if it were a backyard she personally owned. When he finished, the room was quiet, heavy with shifting loyalties and dawning realizations. Then the commissioner turned to me. "Mr. Hale, do you have anything you wish to add?" I stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "My father spent his life protecting this lake," I said. "Not because it was profitable, not because it made him popular, but because land doesn't belong to whoever yells the loudest. It belongs to whoever cares enough to respect it. If the HOA had treated this place with honesty, none of us would be here today." Silence settled over the room like fresh snowfall. Bethany's lawyer shuffled his papers, stalling for time, but even he could feel the tide shifting. The commissioner cleared his throat. "We will recess briefly before issuing a decision." People rose from their seats, buzzing with speculation. Bethany stood rigid, face pale. Jake whispered something again, this time with a hint of panic. Meanwhile, I stepped aside, steadying my breath. Everything was about to change. The commissioner called for a 15-minute recess, and the county hearing room spilled open like someone had kicked over a hornet's nest. Residents crowded the hallway, voices overlapping, some angry, some stunned into whispers. A few glanced my way with cautious respect. Others avoided my eyes entirely, unsure where they stood now that the HOA's armor had cracked. Sarah nudged my shoulder. "You holding up?" "I'm fine," I said, though my pulse buzzed like a loose wire under my skin. "But they're not done. Not yet." She nodded. "No, they're desperate." As if on cue, the restroom door swung open and Jake hurried inside, a little too fast, almost stumbling. Bethany followed him halfway before catching herself, looking around to see who was watching. Her eyes landed on me for a brief, sharp second. Then she turned her back. Desperation. It had a scent. Remy stepped up beside me. "I've seen cows walk calmer into a butcher shop. They know they're cooked." I managed a thin smile. "They'll make one last move. You watch." He raised an eyebrow. "What else could they possibly try?" I didn't answer. I already knew. When the recess ended, we filed back into the room. The crowd settled, but tension hung like dust suspended in a beam of sunlight. Visible, heavy, unavoidable. The commissioner returned to his seat, flipping through the stack of documents Sarah had presented. But before he spoke, the HOA lawyer stood. "Commissioner, if we may, the HOA has one additional piece of documentation to present before the ruling." Sarah stiffened. "They didn't submit anything new to the clerk." The lawyer held up a manila envelope. "We believe this information is important." Bethany's eyes flashed with something like triumph, the first hint of confidence she'd shown since the hearing began. The commissioner motioned for the envelope. "Bring it forward." The lawyer set it on the table, sliding it across. The commissioner opened it, and the moment he pulled out the first sheet, my stomach turned to iron. It was one of my father's old documents, one of the originals. Stolen. Sarah froze beside me. That's one of yours," she whispered. It was. There was no doubt. My father's handwriting, his signature, the corner tear from when he'd once caught the edge under a drawer. The commissioner frowned. "Where did you obtain these papers?" The lawyer cleared his throat. "They were anonymously provided to the HOA shortly before today's hearing." That was a lie so thin it could snap under a breath. Harold had broken into my cabin days ago. I knew it. Sarah knew it. And now she had to prove it. I stood slowly. "Commissioner, those documents were stolen from my property 3 nights ago." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The commissioner raised a brow. "You're alleging theft?" "I'm stating it," I said. "And I have proof." I turned to Sheriff Dalton, who stepped forward with a nod. He held up an evidence folder. Inside was a USB drive from Remy's trail cam. He connected it to the projector, and the lights dimmed as grainy night footage filled the screen. The image showed a hooded figure creeping toward my cabin. The figure climbed the steps, tried the door, then slipped inside. A few minutes later, they emerged carrying a folder in hand. Dalton paused the video, zooming in on the gait, the distinctive inward roll of the right foot. He cleared his throat. "Harold Wilkins, HOA board member, has this exact orthopedic condition. I questioned him earlier this morning. He admitted to entering Mr. Hale's property and removing documents, under the direction of HOA leadership." An eruption of voices filled the room. Shock, anger, betrayal. Bethany's face drained of color, white as the paper she'd tried to weaponize. Jake slammed a hand on the table. "Harold is lying!" "No," Dalton said calmly. "He provided a written statement." The commissioner held up his hands for quiet. "Order. Order." The room silenced. Sarah rose with the controlled fury of a woman who'd been waiting for this moment. "Commissioner, the HOA not only built unlawfully on Mr. Hale's land, not only filed doctored surveys and illegal permits, they stole evidence from his home to manipulate this hearing." The commissioner rubbed his temples. "This is unprecedented." Jake muttered something under his breath. Bethany stared straight ahead, as still as a statue cracking under its own weight. Sarah wasn't finished. "Your Honor," she said, holding up the drought year acquisition file I had found in the dam shed earlier that week. "This is the authentic certified document proving that Mr. Hale owns 60% of the lake bed, the dock area, and the land beneath the Aspen Ridge Community Center. It was stored off-site, out of reach of the HOA, and fully corroborated by the county historian." The commissioner examined it carefully. His expression changed, not dramatically, not theatrically, but with the subtle shift of a man realizing he had been handed the truth in its purest, most irrefutable form. He set the document down and straightened. "Based on the evidence presented," he began, voice steady and clear. I hereby affirm Mr. Hale's ownership of the disputed lands, including the lakebed, shoreline, dock area, and upper lot currently occupied by Aspen Ridge Community Structures. A gasp lifted and fell like a single breath across the room. All fines and violation notices issued by the Aspen Ridge HOA are nullified, he continued. Furthermore, the matter of illegal construction, fraudulent permits, and the theft of documents will be referred to the District Attorney's Office for criminal review. Bethany finally broke. That's not fair, she choked out. We were protecting the community. No, I said quietly. You were protecting your control, Jake. Stood abruptly, chair screeching, and pushed through the crowd, unable or unwilling to face the consequences. Bethany remained frozen as the commissioner adjourned the hearing. It was over. Not the whole war, but the battle that mattered most. As residents filed out, some approached to shake my hand. Others apologized for staying silent so long. Remy slapped my back and whispered, You just cracked the whole damn dam, Marcus. Sarah smiled, a relieved, tired smile. You did it. I looked down at the certified document still sitting on the table. Not just me, my father too. His legacy had spoken louder than the HOA ever could. Outside, the winter sun reflected off the lake like sheets of hammered silver. For the first time in months, I breathed without tension in my chest. But one question still lingered, hanging in the cold air like the echo of a gunshot. Now that I owned nearly everything the HOA had built its power on, what was I going to do with it? For the first time in months, I breathed without tension in my chest. But one question still lingered, hanging in the cold air like the echo of a gunshot. Now that I owned nearly everything the HOA had built its power on, what was I going to do with it? The drive home from the county hearing felt different that day. The road looked the same. Rutted earth, tall pines leaning into the wind, patches of old snow clinging to the north-facing slopes. But something inside me had shifted. The weight I'd been carrying ever since the red eviction notice slapped my door had finally loosened its grip. The land didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like what it had always been. Mine. When I pulled into the driveway, the lake lay in front of me, calm and mirror-still, reflecting the pale winter sun like polished silver. The wind skimmed across its surface, raising tiny ripples that whispered against the dock pilings. The community center across the way, still squarely on my property, looked smaller now. Less like a threat and more like a worn-down reminder of a fight that had cost the HOA everything they tried to steal. Remy arrived not 10 minutes later, his truck kicking up a tail of dust as he wheeled into the yard. He hopped out, cheeks red from the cold, hat barely hanging on. Well, he asked, grinning, world still turning, HOA still crying? According to the commissioner, I said, they're about to be very busy answering questions from the DA. He laughed, deep and loud. Jake's probably halfway to Colorado by now. But his smile faded as he studied my face. You okay? You look settled. I am, I said quietly, for the first time in a long time. We stood there for a while, listening to the lake breathe. The wind carried faint echoes from across the water. Voices, gatherings, the HOA board scrambling to figure out what came next. But their panic didn't belong to me anymore. The following week unfolded like the slow thaw of early spring. News traveled fast through the valley. The local paper ran a headline, Lakebed owner wins case, HOA under investigation. People started showing up, some offering congratulations, others apologizing for keeping quiet so long. A few asked if I planned to bulldoze the community center or shut down the dock entirely. Truth be told, the idea crossed my mind. After everything they'd done, after the fines, the intimidation, The break-in, the lies. It would have been easy to give in to pettiness, to tear down every board, every gate, every artificial thing they tried to place on my father's land. But standing on my dock one morning, watching the sun climb over the pines, I felt my father beside me, not in some mystical sense, just in memory, in the way he always breathed deep before speaking, the way he listened to the land before he made decisions, the way he believed some fights weren't about winning. They were about restoring balance. He taught me something the HOA never understood. Power wasn't what you could take. It was what you chose not to. And so the next step became clear. A week after the hearing, I requested a meeting with the newly reformed HOA board. Bethany and Jake had resigned under pressure from residents and investigators, replaced by neighbors who finally found their voices. We gathered inside the community center, the building that sat squarely on my property. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. I stood at the front of the room, facing a semicircle of anxious homeowners. Sarah stood beside me, arms folded, offering quiet support. Sheriff Dalton lingered near the back, keeping a watchful eye, though he didn't need to intervene anymore. The tension here wasn't aggressive. It was uncertain, hopeful, afraid. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I know the past few months have been rough, for all of us." Chairs creaked. People leaned in. Let me make one thing clear right out of the gate. I'm not shutting down this center. I'm not tearing out the dock. I'm not blocking anyone from the lake. A soft wave of relieved murmurs rippled through the room. "But things are going to change," I added. Every eye lifted again. For years, the HOA used bylaws and fines to bully people into submission. They used fear. They used pressure. They weaponized the idea of community instead of honoring it. That ends now. A few heads nodded. A few lowered in guilt. Some shoulders sagged in emotional release. "I'm willing to draft a new lease," I continued, pulling a stack of papers from my coat. "A fair one, with clear terms. The community can keep this center, the parking lot, and the dock. But in exchange, we protect the lake. No more unauthorized construction, no chemical runoff, no dredging or clearing without approval." I set the papers on the table. "And the shoreline remains natural. No decorative shrubs, no artificial barriers, no attempts to reshape the lake to fit a brochure." A quiet voice from the back asked, "You're giving it back? After everything?" "I'm not giving anything back," I said gently. "I'm setting things right." Sarah smiled. Dalton nodded once. For the first time, the room felt like a community meeting, not a battleground. 2 months later, the new lease was signed and filed with the county. The HOA board, now led by Dave, who stepped up once the dust settled, began cleaning out the mess left behind. They reviewed bylaws. They refunded unjust fines. They apologized. Not all of them, but enough to shift the culture. The lake remained untouched, protected by a conservation easement I established soon after. An agreement guaranteeing no future development could scar its shoreline. Even the dock was rebuilt in places, reinforced with safer beams and a better walkway, all done legally and with respect for the land. Then, 1 year to the day after the eviction notice was nailed to my door, Aspen Ridge hosted a community gathering at the dock. Kids fished off the edge with lines dangling into the shimmering water. Old-timers swapped stories by the picnic tables. Families barbecued along the slope, laughter drifting across the surface of the lake in warm, rolling waves. At the entrance, a new wooden sign stood proudly. Hale Lake Pier, established in honor of Robert Hale. When I saw it, my throat tightened. Not from sadness, from something deeper. Something like coming home to myself after a long, forced detour. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the lake in bands of orange and gold, I untied my father's wooden rowboat and eased it into the still water. The oars slid into place with the familiar creak of old wood, and the lake welcomed me the way it always had, with quiet, with patience. I rowed out into the center, letting the world fall away until it was just me, the lake, and the echo of a legacy preserved. "Some land isn't meant to be owned," I whispered to the water. "It's meant to be protected." The lake rippled, reflecting the last streaks of sunlight, as if agreeing. Justice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Sometimes it was as simple as honoring the truth and choosing the right way forward. And on that lake, in that moment, everything felt exactly the way it was meant to. If this story hit home for you, drop a simple "justice" in the comments. It lets me know you're standing your ground too. Out here, owning land isn't just paperwork. It's pride, memory, and the courage to protect what matters. And if you'd like to stick around for more HOA battles, ranch justice, and real stories from the American backroads, feel free to subscribe. I'd be glad to have you with us on the next one.